Welcome back. So, we've talked about the structure of the write-up. So, and I was about introducing introduction before we took a break in the next video, in the previous video. So, let's continue with introduction. What are the components of writing the introduction for your research work? Your introduction should announce your work. So, you start with a broad idea and you start breaking it down into presenting an understanding for your readers. So you start broadly and you start narrowing it down to sentences or paragraphs that kind of bring the focus to a particular thing you want to talk about. Okay, let's say you are looking at conflicts in a particular setting. You could start with talking about conflicts and its general implication. Then you now bring it down. You start talking now about how conflict relates to other aspects of the society. What are the kind of conflicts, but remember, at this point you are not trying to do a literature review. You are still talking broadly to bring to focus why it is important what you are doing. So this must catch the interest of people and it must communicate the thesis of your work. Try and introduce some of the key terms and relevant for your work. Define these terms broadly when you are working with thesis, but when you are working with articles, you have to go straight to the point. You have to make it concise. It has to be short and straight to the point. This introduction should provide a context or the rationale for your work. So which means it's a very brief literature review. It's not the extensive one that you're going to do in chapter 2. It should bring focus on your area of contribution with the literature presented. How do you intend to address a gap that you have found in literature? So which means in your chapter 1, it should be clear for everybody to see that what is your contribution going to be. We do not have to go through the entire work to understand where are you deviating. Okay? What is it that has not been done that you have identified and needs to be done? So which means it must be clear the rationale for your work. It should be brief. What is novel about your work? Or what is the significance of your work? Remember, your chapter 1, your introduction should not be this bogus 200-page work. It should be concise, should be done in such a way that one can get a quick overview of what you are trying to do by reading your introduction. So, what are the other components you need to take care of? Statement of problem. It is very important that your statement of problem clearly states and highlight what is the problem. Okay, I use this method. I'm sure other people might have other ideas, but this has worked for me for several years. The first thing is the first paragraph I will state what is the desired goal, what is the ideal situation, how things should be. For example, I can say, if I'm working on social vulnerability, I can start that data on social vulnerability is essential for making decisions about hazard and disaster risk management. The availability of such will help the decision makers to know how to preposition resources and materials, and also what are the mitigation measures that should be put in place. However, Many low and middle income countries do not have this kind of data, and these has impacted negatively on their ability to respond to the needs of the people when there is an emergency or there's a hazard event. Therefore, there is need to develop means and method to collect data even within a data sparse environment to enable decision makers to make efficient and appropriate decision to alleviate the suffering of people during an emergency or hazard event. You see, I started with what is the desire, what is the ideal situation, how should things be. Then I moved on to what is the current reality across many of the low and middle income countries. Then I go on to what needs to be done in order to make the reality closer to the ideal situation. That structure is convincing, it's clear, it's logical, it's understandable. That is what I use because I've seen that way it is easy for anybody to understand what is the problem I'm trying to address. Then you have your research questions. Your research question, remember we have talked about this before, so I'm not going to dwell too much on it. You have the rule of thumb. You do not have to ask questions that are yes or no questions. Your question must have potentially more than one answer. You must be able to defend by collecting data. You must be able to defend and explain your answer. So the question must also be in such a way that you can address them within the time that is available for you to carry out the research. Remember, we have two types of questions, testable and non-testable. And depending on which one you are using, one will require hypothesis, while the other will not require hypothesis. If you have testable research question, then you must have hypothesis for them. In your chapter 1, when you are stating your hypothesis, you state the alternative hypothesis. You do not state the null hypothesis in your chapter 1. Think of it this way. Your alternative hypothesis is your intuitive proposition. That is what stimulated you to start the research in the first place. So it is not appropriate for you to put the null hypothesis. You don't start the work thinking that there is nothing going on here. Nobody starts the research thinking there is nothing going on. You start the research, the idea in your mind is that there is something going on. But then you now have to collect data to test the null hypothesis. Because the null hypothesis, we have the unbiased idea that there is nothing going on, and we need data to prove otherwise before we can say there is something going on. So please take note. There is a logic. That is the beauty of the scientific process. There is a logic, a sound logic behind everything we do. So take note. Now, when it comes to your aim and your objective, your title should give us an idea of your aim. And your aim should be one. You should have one aim for your work. You can have several objectives, but you must have only one aim. I use this technique in my work that each of the objectives represent a step in which I must take in order to achieve the aim. So what are the different objectives or different things I must achieve in order to achieve the main aim of the work. So I now turn those objectives into research questions. Okay? You turn your research objectives, you wrap them around your research question. It might not be a direct translation, but each objective should have a question that supports it. And your several objectives, when put together, should help you to achieve the aim of the work. That is the structure to follow.